On a summer's day in early 20th century France, two respectable British academics, Charlotte Ann Moberly and Eleanor Jourdain, stumbled upon a phenomenon that would defy explanation and haunt them for the rest of their lives. While strolling through the gardens of Versailles, they claimed to have crossed an invisible threshold, transporting themselves into the past. The Petit Trianon, once a refuge for Marie Antoinette, became a portal to a bygone era where 18th century courtiers, mysterious figures, and even the ill-fated queen herself seemed to materialize before their eyes. As the women navigated the labyrinthine paths and manicured lawns, the boundaries between reality and fantasy began to blur. Their experiences were fraught with an unsettling sense of déjà vu, eerie silences, and an unshakable feeling of being watched. The encounter would leave a mark on their psyches, sparking an obsessive quest for answers and plunging them into a world of paranormal intrigue. This is the Moberly-Jourdain Incident. Imagine traveling abroad to visit a park or a garden and finding yourself transported, perhaps into a dream or a fugue state, or even back in time. This was what Charlotte Ann Moberly and Eleanor Jourdain experienced as they made their way to the Petit Trianon, a neoclassical chateau adjacent to the Palace of Versailles, on August 10, 1901. The two academics who ran the young women's educational program at St. Hugh's College, Oxford, had taken a ferry from England to France, where they boarded a train bound for Paris and made their way to the grounds for a day's visit. Perhaps these staunch English women were insensitive to luxury, or perhaps the palace had not yet been restored to its full glory after the French Revolution. In any case, these descendants of clergy and proponents of hard work were unimpressed by the royal residence and decided to spend their time exploring the grounds, making their way to the Petit Trianon, which Marie Antoinette had famously made into a country retreat from court life. When the women arrived at Versailles, the sky was overcast, providing a break from the heat and making the day pleasant enough for a long walk. As the elder Miss Moberly recalls, the two women opened their Baedeker travel guide and followed the map to the Petit Trianon. After passing by the Grand Trianon, they had a series of strange encounters and got lost. Just as they came up to the drive that led to the smaller chateau, they decided instead to continue up the lane, with Miss Jourdain leading the way. It was then that the two women began to see and meet people in buildings and along the path they traveled, but somehow not always at the same time, which made their accounts independent and inconsistent. Miss Moberly's written account, which later became part of a book she co-authored with Miss Jourdain, says that when the women came across an intersection of three paths, they saw two men in the center who they assumed to be gardeners, standing near a wheelbarrow and some tools. As the women drew closer to ask for directions, they noticed that the men were dressed up in long greenish coats and three-cornered hats. As Miss Jourdain wrote later, the men answered in a seemingly casual and mechanical way and directed them to go straight on. The women moved forward, and immediately the mood seemed to change. Miss Moberly said, "We walked briskly forward, talking as before, but from the moment we left the lane, an extraordinary depression had come over me, which, in spite of every effort to shake off, continually deepened. And yet, there seemed to be absolutely no reason for it." She continued to note that everything suddenly looked unnatural, therefore unpleasant. Even the trees behind the buildings seemed to have become flat and lifeless, like a woodworked-in tapestry. There were no effects of light and shade, and no wind stirred the trees. It was intensely still. Soon, the women approached a wooded area where Miss Jourdain saw a woman and a teenage girl standing by a cottage wearing kerchiefs. Their outfits seemed old-fashioned and out of place. As the tourists continued on and approached what Miss Moberly described as a circular kiosk, they spied a man in a cloak and a large brim hat looking up at them with malice. His dark, smallpox-scarred complexion startled them. Both women were taken aback by his repulsive and evil expression, and they began to feel very strange, as if they were half asleep. Miss Jourdain recalled, I began to feel as if I were walking in my sleep. The heavy dreaminess was oppressive. At last, we came upon a path crossing ours and saw in front of us a building consisting of some columns roofed in and set back in the trees. Seated on the steps was a man with a heavy black cloak round his shoulders and wearing a slouch hat. At that moment, the eerie feeling which had begun in the garden culminated in a definite impression of something uncanny and fear-inspiring. The man slowly turned his face, which was marked by smallpox. His complexion was very dark. The expression was very evil and yet unseeing. And though I did not feel he was looking particularly at us, I felt a repugnance to going past him. Fortunately, the women were saved by a dashing young man who seemingly appeared out of nowhere, red-faced and animated, imploring them to turn to the right. Miss Jourdain also recalled, "Suddenly we heard a man running behind us. He shouted, 'Madame, Madame!' And when I turned, he said in an accent that seemed to me unusual that our way lay in another direction. We must not go through that. He then made a gesture, adding, 'This way, look for the house.' Though we were surprised to be addressed, we were glad of the direction, and I thanked him. The man ran off with a curious smile on his face. The running ceased as abruptly as it had begun, not far from where we stood. I remember that the man was young-looking with a florid complexion and rather long dark hair. I do not remember the dress, except that the material was dark and heavy, and that the man wore buckled shoes." The women made their way further into the woods, crossed a small bridge near a waterfall, and eventually emerged on the lawn of the Petit Trianon. They crossed the tall grasses, and Miss Moberly noticed a fair-haired lady in a white hat sitting with her back to the northwest terrace of the house, looking at a sketch she held at arm's length. The lady noticed Miss Moberly and Miss Jourdain as they passed to her left, but did not say a word. Miss Moberly noted that her light summer dress was arranged on her shoulders in a handkerchief fashion, and there was a little line of either green or gold near the edge of the handkerchief, which showed me that it was over, not tucked into her bodice, which was cut low. Her dress was long-waisted with a good deal of fullness in the skirt, which seemed to be short. I thought she was a tourist, but that her dress was old-fashioned and rather unusual, although people were wearing fichu bodices that summer. I looked straight at her, but some indescribable feeling made me turn away, annoyed at her being there. Strangely, Miss Jourdain didn't see the lady, even though she must have walked right by her. Nonetheless, she felt her presence, saying, "As we approached the terrace, I remembered drawing my skirt away with a feeling as though someone were near, and I had to make room, and then wondering why I did." When the women arrived at the chateau, they heard a door bang and noticed a young man motioning to them from the southwest side of the terrace, calling out to them to make their way through the French garden to the entrance of the house. Soon, Miss Moberly and Miss Jourdain found themselves near the drive they had passed some time ago, in the front entrance hall and in the midst of a wedding party. They noticed that the air seemed to clear, and feeling energized, they took a carriage back to the Hôtel des Reservoirs in Versailles and had tea. The ladies didn't say much to each other about their experience, and they soon made their way back to the train station. A week later, Miss Moberly asked Miss Jourdain, "Do you think that the Petit Trianon is haunted?" And the other woman answered, "Yes, I do." They went on to discuss the strange dreamlike state they had experienced and the oddly dressed men at the kiosk. 3 months later, on a Sunday in early November, the women met and decided to write down their personal accounts of their experiences, compare notes, and then try to discover what actually happened. When Miss Jourdain returned to her school that fall evening, she prepared the next morning's lecture, which happened to be on the French Revolution. As she was visiting with a friend from Paris, she realized that August 10 was the anniversary of the day in 1792 that Marie Antoinette and King Louis XVI were attacked at Tuileries, and wondered if she had somehow wandered into the Queen's memory on the day of her visit. In January 1902, Miss Jourdain returned to the grounds of Versailles alone, again experiencing a strange oppression as she wandered through the woods, noting that as she crossed the bridge, the old feeling returned in full force. It was as if I had crossed a line and was suddenly in a circle of influence. She saw 2 men in oddly pointed terracotta and deep blue-colored hoods filling a cart with sticks. but in a moment, they seemed to disappear into thin air. As she made her way along the path, she felt that she was surrounded by a crowd of French-speaking people pressing in on her. In the distance, she heard a low-pitched music that sounded unnatural, like it was being played from a phonograph. Later, she asked some people at Versailles about the music, but they said that the band had been there yesterday to celebrate the New Year's holiday. She made note of the tune on paper for future reference. After this second visit, Miss Moberly and Miss Jourdain became very curious about what had happened to them during their visits and decided to investigate. On a hot Saturday, July 9, 1904, the pair returned to the Trianon, which had changed completely. The grounds seemed to be more open, and the winding paths, the kiosk, and the small bridge they had crossed had disappeared. Even the exterior of the Petit Trianon seemed different than they had remembered. Most of all, they noticed that the gardens were full of visitors and dotted with lemonade stands. The mood was cheerful, and they did not meet any strange people on their journey. The women stopped by a bookshop and asked the man inside for an old map of the Petit Trianon, and further inquired about the officials in green uniforms they had seen on their first visit. The man replied that green was one of the colors of the royal liveries, and that what the women had experienced was impossible, unless, he added, they were masqueraders. When the women asked the locals about the state of the gardens, they learned that they had been open to the public for decades. Shocked, Miss Moberly and Miss Jourdain became obsessed with finding a reasonable explanation for their experience, and spent the years between 1904 and 1910 conducting historical research on the area surrounding the Petit Trianon to see how the grounds may have changed and learn who spent time there. By reading through books, poring over archives, and making inquiries, they made accounts of the landscaping and the people they believed they had encountered, such as the smallpox-scarred Comte de Vaudreuil, the favorite and the betrayer of the Queen, and the messenger who had directed them to the chateau, who they believed was with Marie Antoinette on October 5, 1789, the day of the March on Versailles. Miss Moberly also noted that a portrait of Marie Antoinette painted by Wertmüller bore an extreme resemblance to the woman she had seen making sketches by the terrace, who was dressed in the fashions of the day. Convinced they had traveled back in time, Miss Moberly and Miss Jourdain decided to write a book about their experience, which they titled An Adventure, and published it under their pseudonyms Elizabeth Morrison and Frances Lamont in 1911. At the beginning of their report, Miss Moberly writes, "It's not our business to explain or to understand, nor do we pretend to understand. What happened to us put us in communication with so many true facts, which 9 years ago, no one could have told us of in their entirety. But in order that others may be able to judge fairly of all the circumstances, we have tried to record exactly what happened as simply and fully as possible." An adventure becomes a sensation. The book, which included the story of how Miss Moberly had encountered Marie Antoinette in 1901, caused a sensation and a scandal. Although the book became a popular bestseller and was in fact revised and printed several times, most critics found it to be an implausible and fantastic account. The Proceedings of the Society for Psychical Research published a review suggesting that the women had misinterpreted a normal tourist experience. Others suggested that the women had simply run across modern people costumed for a reenactment participating in a film. At the time, a man named Robert de Montesquieu was known for holding fancy dress fêtes galantes at Versailles, where he and his friends would dress up as members of the French royal court. Although, as authors, Miss Moberly and Miss Jourdain remained anonymous until 1931, during their time at Oxford, they developed a reputation for odd behavior and made claims about having paranormal experiences. Many say that their adventures were an open secret and that their accounts made it difficult to take them seriously as scholars. During World War I, Miss Jourdain succeeded Miss Moberly as principal of St. Hugh's and spent time trying to root out a German spy who she believed was hiding on campus. By 1924, she had become embroiled in an academic scandal over her behavior and leadership, and in that year, she died suddenly. Miss Moberly passed away in 1937. Today, many people wonder if Miss Moberly and Miss Jourdain simply fabricated their story or convinced themselves it was true in a bid for attention. Neither woman had married, and perhaps they wanted to be seen as something more than old spinsters and contribute something important to the world. Whether they actually traveled back in time is up for debate. Some do believe that their time slip may have actually happened, just as they said. In any case, their story is likely to remain an enduring mystery that will never truly be solved.